10 little Indian boys went out to dine. One choked his little self, and then there were 9. 9 little Indian boys sat up very late. One overslept himself, and then there were 8. 8 little Indian boys traveling in Devon. One said he'd stay there, and then there were 7. 7 little Indian boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in halves, and then there were 6. 6 little Indian boys playing with a hive. A bumblebee stung one, and then there were 5. 5 little Indian boys going in for law. One got in chancery, and then there were 4. 4 little Indian boys going out to sea. A red herring swallowed one, and then there were 3. 3 little Indian boys walking in the zoo. A big bear hugged one, and then there were 2. 2 little Indian boys sitting in the sun. One got frizzled up, and then there was 1. 1 little Indian boy left all alone. He went out and hanged himself, and then there were none.
Welcome to This Is Lit, a podcast where we drink and talk about our favorite books. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Casey.
And we're your hosts, so everybody raise a glass and let's get started.
Okay, Liz, what are you drinking today?
Well, I am drinking Fairwater from Clarksburg. It's a 2017 Chenin Blanc. Chenin Blanc. The back description says it emits lustrous opulence with notes of orchard apple, lemon peel, and honeycomb. So this may be a little bit too sweet for me. We'll see. And this is how fancy it is.
Another twist top!
And you are drinking
Concordia from your winery.
Yes, made with the All-American Concord grape. We call that grape juice for adults. Fun fact that I actually later learned, since I know you are a giant fan of Hamilton, Concord grape is actually the only grape that grows naturally in North America. Thomas Jefferson tried to make wine out of it and failed. So you are now mocking him with the wine in your glass.
I'll drink to that. Fuck that guy.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Definitely citrus tones in this one. Little bit of sweetness. It's not bad.
This does not even taste like wine.
We call it grape juice for adults for a reason, Casey.
It doesn't taste like grape juice either. It just kind of tastes like purple. It's neither good nor bad. It simply
just kind of
is.
It is.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I feel about this one. It is.
Can I try
but it's far more tolerable than that rosé we had to abandon.
Oh. Yeah, this is too dry for me, but it's not bad.
Yeah.
Speaking of the rosé we abandoned, Karina mixed it with a variety of different things over the course of the next week, and she got rid of the bottle for us. So cheers to Karina for getting rid of the nasty rosé by mixing it with rum and triple sec and whatever else she found in our liquor
disaster danger
cabinet.
So I am now drinking because that thing you just read is possibly going to give me nightmares.
Today we're talking about And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie.
Yes.
A book that was originally released under a very unfortunate title, The 10 Little N-Words.
Yes. And then was
re-released under the title 10 Little Indians.
And then was released in... When it was released originally in the UK under that unfortunate title, it was released in the United States
As 10 Little Indians.
Yeah, and then it was changed to And Then There Were None.
Which is the more preferable term, which
Yes.
is also the final line of the poem, obviously. But the so I read up on this a little bit. Obviously, the original title with the N-word in it was obviously very derogatory, and
just a bit.
Because the original poem, the poem is a real poem. She did not write it for the book. It is an old nursery rhyme, and I read that this
is a dark nursery rhyme.
All nursery rhymes are dark. Jack and Jill died.
Ringing around the rosy was to prevent people from getting plague.
So, I mean, nursery rhymes have a history of being dark. But this one specifically, I read a professor talking about it, and he said there are lots of different variants of it, and ways that children die in the story are different, but one fact is always the same. It's always dark-skinned little boys getting into trouble. So there's been a racist undertone to this poem from the beginning. And in the book, the reason that poem was used was because there were 10 figurines, and also because it took place on an island of the same name. In the UK, It was the N-word island. In the US, and this stays the same in the book, even after they change the title to And Then There Were None, the book takes place on Indian Island.
Yes, and now now that they realize that is also horribly insensitive, they change it to soldiers. So 10 little soldier boys in the poem, and they change the name of the island to Soldier Island.
Yes, I've heard soldier boys, and I've heard ruffians as well. There's a couple of different variants. But in my version of the book, it was 10 little Indians. I think Liz read with 10 little soldiers.
Mine is 10 little soldiers.
I got mine off of Project Gutenberg. Shout out to the biggest organization online that offers free books to people. It's pretty much if a book is past its copyright date, they have it for free on there in a PDF file that you can download and read.
That's pretty cool.
And some of them even in audio. So yeah, shout out to Project Gutenberg.
I had the audiobook, which was narrated by Dan Stevens.
Interesting.
Shout out to Dan Stevens.
So,
and your pretty blue eyes.
So another thing I wanted to discuss about this book before we got into it too much is the fact that it's Agatha Christie, and I'm a big Agatha Christie fan. Her most famous work is The Mousetrap, and almost all of her books were later turned into plays. And The Mousetrap specifically is, they call it the best kept secret in theater, because every time they do a performance of The Mousetrap, it is part of the introduction to the show. Don't spoil the ending. Don't tell us who the murderer is. Keep it to yourself. Don't post about it. Don't talk about it outside the theater with people who haven't seen it, because we want it to be a surprise to everyone the first time they see it. So, when we decided to do an Agatha Christie novel for the podcast, I specifically chose not to do The Mousetrap because of that. That said, I still am going to, even though you already know this because you're listening to a book club podcast, I am going to give a spoiler warning that we are going to discuss this book in depth, including the true murderer at the end of the book. So if you don't want to hear that, if you want to hear it like Agatha Christie intended you to, go read the book first. Come back. We'll wait.
I don't know why you are listening to this without reading the book first, but we'll wait. Insert elevator music. Okay, you read the book. You're back. Good. Now we can talk about it.
So, And Then There Were None begins with 10 different characters.
Yes. All on their way.
Getting mysterious letters or invitations to go to this island out in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
And all of them get different invites to go there. One is like getting a job offer. One is been invited by someone who she maybe went on vacation with in the past. It's all very mysterious.
Someone is asked to come out there in a professional capacity. Someone is just told, you just need to go out there and be prepared for trouble. Someone is just like, just come because we're having a party. And
yeah, so everyone is there for a different reason. None of them really know what they're going to the island to, and no one really knows what to expect.
No.
Now, there are several other characters in the book, but the main characters are the 10 people who are invited to the island.
Yes.
Now, this is an interesting thing that Agatha Christie always does.
Well, there are 8 people invited to the island,
and there are 2 housekeepers. And the butler.
Yes.
So, this is an interesting thing that Agatha Christie always does, and is pretty typical of murder mysteries. We're going to go ahead and spoil right off the bat a little bit. She introduces you to the murderer along with the rest of the main cast.
She does.
The rule of a murder mystery, there's a specific name for this. I looked it up once, and I can't remember it now. It's escaping me. But the rule is, if you're going to have a murder mystery, the murderer needs to be one of your characters that's introduced right away.
Yeah.
You can't just have someone because it's not satisfying to a reader to read a whole book about people dying, and then at the end it's like, it's Joe Schmo from down the block that you didn't even know was around. It's way more interesting if it was someone you've already been introduced to.
And it is a rule of literature to, quote-unquote, introduce your antagonist on the first page. Mm-hmm. So that way your reader just kind of knows what it's in for. It forces the action to start sooner. It keeps you from being like, oh, this person woke up and brushed their teeth. That's not interesting.
Yes. So, let's talk about our characters. The first character we have is Anthony Marston. He's a playboy. He's he's first introduced speeding along the street in his fancy sports car. Then, of course...
I had an immediate dislike of him.
Same. And it just grew as the story went on.
Yes.
Next up, we have General MacArthur, who is a World War I general.
Yes.
He's a very strict man, and he is introduced sitting in a train car, thinking about the contents of the letter he received.
Yes.
Then we have Miss Emily Brent, who is the other character I really dislike.
Immediately also disliked her.
She's kind of a religious fundamentalist. She's very judgy of everybody else.
She's a nutter.
And then we've got Mr. Justice Wargrave, who is an old judge, who I think now is retired.
Yes.
But he did many cases. He was a very prolific judge in his time.
Yes, and he had a reputation for being a hanging judge.
A very strict judge, a hanging judge.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Armstrong is a surgeon.
Yes.
And Detective Bloor used to work for Scotland Yard. He no longer does. And then, let's see what else. We've got Philip Lombard, who's a soldier.
Of fortune.
And then Vera Claythorne, who used to be a nanny. She got asked out to the island as a secretary, essentially.
Yes. And we also have Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, the butler and maid.
And the caretaker of the house on Indian Island.
Yes.
So all these people gather on the island. And within just a few hours of arriving, they realize something's afoot because they're all sitting together in the sitting room whenever a loud voice suddenly accuses them all of murder.
In a very... It's in a very certain way, which as soon as, like, they... You know, I heard it read by Dan Stevens, who obviously knew the end of the book, but the way that it was read in the audiobook made me... It kind of was like a clue that kind of pointed to the main person, but it was a very black and white, you are accused of the death of this person.
Right. He doesn't necessarily explicitly say... You're a murderer. It says you caused the death of these people.
Yes.
Whether it was through an action or through artifice, you essentially killed them. These are essentially crimes that
are outside the court of law.
Right. People couldn't be charged with these crimes. So the first we find out about is Marston had hit pedestrians with his car and killed them.
He had hit 2 children, yes.
And he has absolutely no...
He has no remorse
about this. He's like, it's just a sad thing that happened. It's fine. And moves on.
Yeah. He's like, I got my license suspended for like 6 months.
MacArthur, the general, his wife was having an affair with another man.
Yes.
And in the very traditional, very old story of David and Bathsheba, he sent the man away to the front lines where he knew he would not survive, and the man died. We don't find out immediately what Ms. Brent is accused of.
No,
she won't allow for the like everyone else shares their details pretty well.
She won't for details to come out because she's like, this is absolutely ridiculous. I
did wrong.
Absolutely nothing, which is very telling. She did do absolutely nothing.
Yeah, Mr. Justice Wargrave is accused of having murdered a man whose trial he proceeded over.
Yes,
he convinced the jury essentially to hang the man, even though there wasn't good evidence that he was guilty. And he had won over the jury before the end, but then the judge basically pushed the jury in the direction he wanted them to go.
Yes.
Dr. Armstrong performed an operation on a patient while he was drunk.
Yes, which is what you should not do.
And she died.
But he barely remembers it because he was drunk.
And then the detective, Bloor, lied in order to fake evidence to lock up a man who ended up being innocent.
Yeah.
That one.
And he died in prison.
He died in prison, Then Philip Lombard, was traveling with a Native African tribe, and something happened.
And he left them to die.
I think they fell ill, or like they were set upon, and he basically...
I think it was they were set upon.
He basically jumped ship and like escaped with his own skin, and he also feels no remorse because he was like, it's natural for a man to keep himself alive.
Yeah, and he's like, they were natives, no one cared.
Right.
Which is...
and then Vera is the most interesting to me. Vera Claythorne. She was a nanny, and she had a very frail child that she was watching over, and he tried to swim too far out in the lake
into sea,
and he drowned. She almost drowned going after him.
Yeah, and Mr. and Mrs. Rogers were
taking care of an old woman.
They were taking care of an old woman, and she had heart problems, and she had a heart attack.
Because she wasn't given the medication she needed.
Yeah, because she wasn't given the medication she needed, and she died.
So the gramophone basically lists out all of these sins and says you're here to pay for them.
But it takes a while for all the full stories of everything to come out.
Well, this is another traditional aspect of the murder mystery story.
You get
is
pieces.
that the narrator is always unreliable.
Always.
Whether it's the narrator's unreliable because they don't want you to know something. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. A story where that happens.
Oh gosh, it was another Agatha Christie one. Was it The Strange Affair at Styles?
Yeah.
So that narrator was unreliable.
The narrator didn't want you to know something. Then you have a situation where the narrator has a bad perspective because they were too close to the events, like Nick in The Great Gatsby.
Yes, exactly.
And then you have the situation of a narrator who is completely outside the events and has thinks it behaves as though they're omniscient, but they aren't. They don't have all the details.
Yes.
And that's what this situation is. This is a narrator outside of the events who just doesn't have all the details.
Yeah.
So they're slowly coming out over the course of this visit, but before much can happen, we already have our first death.
Yes.
And it is Anthony Marston picks up a drink, cheers to long life, takes a drink, drops dead on the carpet.
Yes.
So
one choked himself, and then there were 9.
Right. So we've already got one person dead, and they immediately try to dismiss it as a suicide,
which is so dumb.
They're like, oh, he must have killed himself because the gramophone. Oh, wait, we forgot to mention that the gramophone was hidden in another room.
Yes.
And it was played through a wall. And this is interesting to me because one of my very favorite movies of all time is Clue.
I love Clue.
Which is a comedy. It's a dark comedy. And it's basically, there are huge parts of it that are basically just parodying this novel.
Exactly.
Especially
literally the third ending.
Literally everyone is invited to this house under mysterious circumstances.
And then people start dying.
A gramophone plays and tells them that they're all there to be blackmailed.
Yes.
And then people start dying one by one. So it's like a lot of Clue was lifted straight from this and parodied in a humorous fashion. And that's what I think of. But the person who played the gramophone was Mr. Rogers, who just did it because the letter that he got, which, by the way, the person who sent the letters to everyone was
U.N. Owen.
Was U.N. Owen, which they later figure out is just unknown. It's kind of a play on words. And that person had instructed Mr. Rogers to play the gramophone once everyone had arrived.
Which he did, faithfully, and then he heard what was on it, and
Mrs. Rogers fainted.
Mrs. Rogers fainted straight away.
She's very, very upset about this. So, as the novel goes on, more people die. The second person to die is Mrs. Rogers.
Mrs. Rogers. But they don't know till the next morning.
They don't, right. The other thing we should mention, and we forgot all about, and I mentioned it at the very beginning, but again, when they first arrived, they noticed 2 things that are unusual about the house. 3 things. First, it's very modern, which is unusual.
Very modern home.
It's very unusual for the island that is on, and there's not a lot of places to hide, not a lot of crooks and crannies.
No.
The second thing they notice is in the dining room, there are 10 little ceramic Indian statues.
Or soldiers.
And then the poem 10 Little Indians is in every bedroom.
Framed.
And after Marston dies, there are only 9. And so they're all a little unnerved, but they basically justify that he probably killed himself so that they can sleep, because they're all very freaked out at this point.
Yes.
The thing about Agatha Christie is, I like Agatha Christie, but most of her characters are fairly one-note. So you don't get a lot of insight into their emotional state at this point. Other than, through a very obvious thing like Mrs. Rogers fainting.
Yes.
So they all just decide to go to bed and, the boat is supposed to arrive between 7 and 8 tomorrow morning. We'll just leave immediately. Yeah. The next morning...
And when I heard that, I went, oh, honey, no. I will say that with this book, you really need 2 read-throughs of it. Because I had never read this book before. Mm-hmm. So as soon as we got to the ending, I went... Huh? And had to go back and reread it and look for stuff.
So we won't reveal anything just yet, but I'm curious. Did you figure it out before you got to the end who the murderer was?
I had a sneaking suspicion.
You had a suspicion?
And then certain events happened, and I'm like, oh, well, it can't be them anymore.
Oh,
and
so
then
you were
the
wrong.
ending happened, and I'm like, God dang it, I was right.
Oh, I see. Okay. So, this is my 5th or 6th read of this book.
Yeah.
I've read this book several times. The first time I ever read it was in the 7th grade. I picked it up because it had a noose on the cover. And
Casey!
I was curious. It's not the first book I've picked up because it had a noose on the cover. I don't know.
I did pick up a book one time because it had a bloody chandelier on the cover.
See, it's not just me. I'm not the only morbid fucker here. The next morning, everyone wakes up except Mrs. Rogers.
Yes, and there are 8 little figurines on the table.
There are only 8 figurines at the table. Mrs. Rogers never wakes up.
And
Just like the second line of the poem.
The doctor falls under heavy suspicion because he gave her something to sleep the night before. And so they're like, if it wasn't for Mrs. Rogers, we could write off everything as being... We could write off Armstrong as being a suicide or a coincidence. But 2 suicides after that? No.
Right.
No, we're not.
So, everyone's thoroughly unnerved at this point. And then... The general, especially, starts to get very melancholy. He goes out and he's sitting outside on the cliffs and he says he has an odd feeling that he doesn't want to leave the island.
Yeah.
Which is foreshadowing that he's going to be the next to die because the next line of the poem
went to Devon.
He said he'd stay there, and then there were 7.
He's like, none of us are leaving the island, and he has resigned himself to his fate.
And sure enough, he is the next one to die at the beginning of the next chapter. He's found bludgeoned.
And this is after Armstrong, Lombard, and, what is it?
Detective Bloor?
Yes, Bloor go search the island.
They search the island top to bottom. There are no caves.
One is there.
They rappel down the side of the cliff to see if there are any caves on the side. There's no places to hide in the house. But eventually they find the general bludgeoned to death outside.
This is when they're all called into lunch, and Vera is like, oh, he's just sitting out there. And they go out there, and Rogers is like, he's dead. And so then suspicion falls on Rogers, of course, because he's like, they could have just said he was dead, and he was the one that did it.
Well, there was a decent amount of suspicion on
Vera, too.
Lombard, because while they were rappelling down the cliff, it was discovered that he brought a gun with him to the island.
Yes.
So there's a lot
because he was
going
told
on.
Prepare for trouble.
It is Lombard who brought the gun, right?
Double. Yeah.
Or it wasn't the detective?
It was Lombard. Lombard has his revolver.
The soldier.
The
Lombard.
Soldier of Fortune.
Yes. So, they all go into lunch. There are only 7 figurines left on the table, and at this point, they're all thoroughly freaking out.
Yeah, and this is when things pick up like crazy.
People start getting suspicious of each other, and this is when Justice Wargrave suggests what they have not yet considered, that rather than the murderer being concealed somewhere on the island, the murderer is one of them.
Which is very important.
Now, this is the point in the book where I got very suspicious of Justice Wargrave. Because he's talking with so much authority.
Yeah, my first read-through, and he was the one that it's like, it's one of us, and then he's like, I don't think that's
it's
how
one
it
of
happened.
us. It's one of us, and they're clearly a psychopath because they've put this poem in the rooms, and the Indians are disappearing.
Yeah.
Like, he talks about the case with such knowledge.
And with the way the record was voiced, it's like, you stand accused of, and then afterward he's like, well, does anyone have any explanation for this? He was holding court.
He literally says, we're holding court.
Yeah.
And so at that point I get very suspicious of Justice Wargrave, and everyone starts to be very suspicious of one another.
Yes, definitely.
Now, the next person to die is...
Rogers. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
The next morning.
Right.
He went to go chop the sticks for the stove, and they can't find him, and he was chopped in the back of the head with an axe.
With the axe. Someone took his axe and chopped him.
Is terrifying.
So, and of course, another Indian figurine disappears off the table at this time. And everyone is getting more and more suspicious of each other. They're not trusting each other. very soon after Ms. Britt dies. But this is only after we finally find out what she did, which is...
She tells Vera, which is she had a housemaid.
Who was basically a teenager.
And she became pregnant out of wedlock.
And so she turned her out of the house.
Being the Christian crazy she is, she turned her out of the house.
And the girl threw herself in the river.
The girl threw herself in the river. So it's like her crime was doing absolutely nothing. She did nothing to help this girl and prevent her from throwing herself in the river.
So, very, very soon after she confesses this to Vera, she is pricked on the neck with a hypodermic needle.
Yes.
And dies. And bumblebee...
some asshole brings the bumblebee to make it look like a bee sting.
Put into the room.
And that's how you know this person is psycho.
A bumblebee stung one, and then there were 5.
Yes.
So at this point, like Liz, my first read through, was absolutely certain it was Justice Wargrave.
I was positive it was Justice Wargrave.
He was very adamant about how things were going down, describing the killer's thoughts and motivations in a way that you shouldn't know unless you're doing it.
And that is something where before I noticed this on my second read through with when they're all sitting around for lunch and Emily Brent is there, and there is a line where he asks her, "Do you want more coffee?" And it's just a kind of a throwaway line. Mm-hmm. But then they also do they go around the table about everybody's thoughts, and he says, "Have to be careful now so he won't notice." That made me immediately go, so he won't notice what? Mm-hmm. So I was certain it was him my first read through. But
then the rest of the household finds Justice Wargrave with a gunshot wound to his head, with a curtain wrapped around him like a judge's robe, and someone's
scarlet
wool
judge's robe, and someone's wool as his
on his
justice
head
hat.
like a wig.
Yeah.
And that fits with the poem. 4 little Indian boys going in for law. One got in chancery, and then there were 4. The doctor confirms that he's dead from a gunshot wound to the head. So at that point, I was like, okay, I was wrong.
I was wrong too. I'm like, gosh darn it. And
I thought I had it. I thought I had it
too. And then I'm like, okay, well then, I'm like, maybe it's the doctor, but he has no motivation to know anybody. That's another reason I thought it was the judge originally.
Well,
because
I never thought it was
who else would know all of this?
I never thought it was the doctor, because the doctor is the next one to die.
Yeah.
One was swallowed by a red herring, and then there were 4. The doctor was thrown off the cliffs. Outside and died.
And was missing.
They eventually found his...
I'm like, if it is...
Everyone who dies after Justice Wargrave, it happens...
really quickly.
Like I don't even think you find them in the right order. Like,
they don't find them in the right order.
Dr. Armstrong goes missing.
Dr. Armstrong is the next... He goes missing.
He's the next to die, but
he's the next to die.
They don't discover his body until after...
Until after Bloor is killed.
And Bloor is clunked over the head with a marble clock shaped like a bear.
Yeah, which was thrown out of Vera's room. However, Vera couldn't have done it, and neither could Lombard, because they were together on the beach when that happened, so they thought it was the doctor.
But then they found the doctor's body.
Yeah.
And that's when Vera...
And as soon as that happened, I'm like, it's somebody that's not dead.
Yeah.
Which was my thought, it's like one of these deaths didn't happen.
So, at this point, Bloor and Dr. Armstrong are found back to back. All that is left is Vera and Philip Lombard. And they both think the other one is the killer. She kind of has
a little bit of a psychotic break.
Yeah. I mean, who wouldn't, right?
Yeah.
And so they both think the other one is the murderer, but she gets a hold of his gun. She goes back to his room and takes his gun.
Yeah.
And she kills him. She shoots him.
Well, she's helping him pull the doctor's body out of the water, and she pickpockets him.
That's right.
And
so
she shoots him.
She realizes when they're pulling the doctor's body out of the water that they're the only 2 left. She knows she's not the killer. So by process of elimination, it has to be Philip. She takes his gun, she shoots him.
One got frizzled, and then there was 1.
And at this point,
And I'm like, the first read-through, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's going to make it, except she had made a mention of a hook in her room.
That had appeared on the ceiling.
Randomly on the ceiling, and she's like, I don't like the look of that hook.
So after she's killed Philip Lombard, Vera is alone on the island. There's a storm still happening.
Yeah, and she is relieved because she thinks she survived. She takes the little figurine off the table because she's like, you and I get to go home. And then she gets up to her room, and there is a noose waiting for her.
Yes, but she is the one who chooses to use the
Yes.
noose. No one forces her into the noose. She
No.
kills herself.
She has a psychotic break and ends her life.
She feels guilt for the child that died under her
Yes.
care. She feels guilt for shooting Lombard. And so she hangs herself.
Yes.
And then Scotland Yard the next day, the boat comes back out, finds
Yes.
10 dead bodies on the island.
And is like, what
the hell? They don't figure it out on their own.
But they know Vera was not the one who did it because the chair that she had used to climb up and put her head in the noose was pushed back against the wall. It wasn't knocked over in her room. So there was obviously somebody on the island still alive when Vera committed suicide.
So, but they figure they'll just never solve it.
Yeah.
And then the epilogue of the book is, instead of like the rest of the book, which was
Yeah.
written in third person point of view, it's written in first person from the perspective of the killer, who describes exactly how everything went down, and basically it was put into a
Yes.
bottle and thrown out into the water
And then it was later found.
and turned into Scotland Yard. And the killer
Is
Justice
Justice
Wargrave,
Wargrave.
just like we suspected.
Yes.
He
He faked his death.
Convinced Dr. Armstrong
With the
that
help
in
of the
order
doctor.
to... Basically what he did is he convinced Dr. Armstrong he wasn't the murderer, and that in order to help find the murderer, he needed the murderer to think he was dead.
Yes. So
Armstrong bought it,
which leads into the line, he was swallowed by a red herring.
a red herring. Armstrong bought it, helped him fake his death, and Wargrave returned the help by pushing him into the cliff.
And killing him.
So the epilogue basically re-describes
And then-
everything that has happened from Wargrave's perspective.
Yeah, and he talks about and after Vera committed suicide, he shot himself in the head.
He
Like
basically
he had
hooked
staged.
a pistol with a string and some implements and made it look like he had been shot by someone else.
And that is kind of a clue when you're reading the chapter from the detective's perspective. The pistol was found outside someone else's door than where Vera had dropped it.
Correct. And he reveals that he has been diagnosed with a fatal illness.
Yes.
And he's gonna die
"Well,
anyway."
Go out with a bang.
He's a psychopath. He's a literal psychopath. And this is the most interesting thing to me, and this is the thing that I really got on this read-through that I hadn't in the past, was that Justice Wargrave, not only does he want to see quote-unquote justice done on these people who cannot be legally prosecuted, he also has ranked their crimes according to some personal scale of what is the worst.
And the one he deems the worst is the last to die.
Which is interesting to me, because in some parts of the scale I would agree with him.
And in other parts, I'm like, what were you thinking?
For example, I would say Vera is the least culpable of any of them.
Exactly. I agree,
She-
but he believes she is the most...
The worst thing that Vera did was
Awful.
lie
Yeah.
about the situation. Because what happened was this little boy who wanted to swim out to this rock in the water was too
Yeah.
frail for it. She knew he was too frail for it, and she jokingly told him he could, didn't think he would take
Yeah.
her up on it. He did, and when she saw he was drowning, she immediately jumped in the water and tried to save him, almost drowned herself.
And almost drowned herself trying to get to him.
The only thing
And
she
then-
did was whenever it was investigated, she did not tell them that she had given him permission to swim out to the rock.
Because
She was scared.
She was scared. And she was in love with the...
Uncle.
The child's uncle, who was the second son. And so he assumed of the woman he loved that she did it on purpose.
And he is the one who told Justice Wargrave about her.
Yes,
After
drunkenly.
he left her.
Drunkenly.
He was drunk and upset, and after he left
And
her...
so she was heartbroken. She was guilt-ridden over the death of this child.
But she had no malicious intent.
No.
Which is why it's interesting to me that Wargrave determined her to be the worst of them all.
Yeah, this
Especially whenever Marston was drunk driving and showed no remorse.
Yeah.
Killed 2 people. When Mr. Rogers just withheld medicine from an elderly woman to
Yeah.
see her die. And made
convinced
his wife...
wife to do...
Made his wife an
his wife
accomplice
do it.
to it.
Yeah.
Like, she really didn't know what was going on.
That's terrible.
And then,
Dr. Armstrong performing surgery while drunk on an innocent woman?
yeah, but, like, yeah.
That's...
Like, to me, the worst of them are Anthony Marston,
Yes, because he feels no remorse.
Mr. Rogers, and I would say probably General MacArthur. Like, I think it's a damn shame that Emily Brent doesn't feel remorse for what happened to the girl.
Yeah.
But that gets into a whole nother thing. Like, if
you cannot blame somebody for their own decisions.
Right, exactly. Like you see so many times, like, abusive boyfriends being like, if you leave me, I'll kill myself. Like, that's not that woman's fault if he does. Like, should she have turned a pregnant teenager out of her house? No. But did she know
she was going to drown
jump
herself in the river? No, and that is something that...
Like, it's a shame that she didn't feel remorse for it. Like, I don't understand what kind of person you'd have to be to not feel remorse.
That really bothers me, because when I was in high school, I was in a situation where I was in a relationship with someone who was just really bad for my mental health and was emotionally abusive, and I did not want to end the relationship because I thought they would do something like that, and it went on way too long.
Right.
But I finally did end it, but I'm like, oh my god, if they do something, it's my fault.
Right. So I do not like Emily Brent at all.
No, I don't like her.
But I think she is much less culpable than the
Exactly.
others.
Yeah.
I think even Dr. Armstrong, like, it's horrible what he did, but, like, from the perspective of a surgeon, if he didn't realize how drunk he was and he thought he was, like, this has to be done now, or she's going to die. Like, I'm not saying it's acceptable, and he is culpable for that death, and he should, and nowadays could be prosecuted for that.
Yes,
but he kept it. He and the nurse who worked with this child.
This is very kind of an eye for an eye justice.
Yeah, the Justice Wargrave is very much black and white. Like, if someone died and you were related to their death in any way,
a lot of
you're
these
responsible
deaths,
for it.
I feel like, are revenge and not justice.
Explain.
Like, there's a very thin line between revenge and justice, and I feel like revenge is an eye for an eye. And I feel like justice is holding someone accountable for their decisions.
I think for it to be revenge, Wargrave would either have to have been the person wronged by them or be related to the person.
For most revenge, it's like you have to have a personal vendetta.
Yeah. I would say for it to be revenge, you have to have a personal vendetta.
No, but it's a very kind of, for me, it feels more like revenge, even though there is no personal vendetta.
I don't know. I don't think it's revenge. I think Justice Wargrave...
It's a very black and white
mentally
eye
ill.
justice.
I think he's a psychopath.
Oh yeah, he's definitely a psychopath.
Like first off, like the idea that like you find out you are dying, and you're like, well, I'm going to commit a mass murder
with me
of 9 other people at the same time.
If I might as well take someone with me. That's psychopath.
I'm gonna go full Jigsaw on them and like make mental games out of it. Like
no.
It's I don't know, it's interesting to me. The other thing that's interesting to me is that, I mean, he has a terminal illness, so he's going to die no matter what, but he kills himself.
Yeah.
Which suggests that his justification that if you are a killer, you should be killed, he applies it to himself as well.
Yes, he does.
He's like, I've killed these people, I deserve justice upon myself as well, and that's why I'm going to kill myself. So it's not just like, so that's why I say it's not revenge. That's why I say it's just like, he has a hyperfixation with justice.
It's a very twisted sense of justice.
Yeah, well, it's a hyperfixation on justice and what it means to command justice.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's revenge, because if it was revenge, he would have stayed alive to celebrate the fruits of his labor.
Yeah.
But since he believed, he wasn't just talking out of his ass, like, oh, anyone who commits murder deserves to die themselves.
He
believed that, and he killed himself because of it.
And his definition of murder is
much looser than anyone else's.
Someone's death is associated with you, not that you held the gun or the knife or held their head underwater or pushed them. By
Justice Wargrave's definition, if a woman had a boyfriend who was threatening to kill himself if she left him,
and
she would be responsible for his death.
Yeah.
By his definition of murder.
Yeah.
But I think that's what's so interesting to me, is not only does he have this twisted definition of what murder is and whose responsibility things are, it's so abstract.
It really is.
Because, like, I mean, even if you argue that Vera is responsible for this child's death,
even if you argue that Vera on a subconscious level wanted to kill this child,
it's still not nearly as bad as, like, someone who actively, like, withheld medicine from someone.
Someone who made the decision to let this person die.
Like, from his perspective of justification, he was like, well, Marston... I don't understand what his justification for Marston was. I'll just bypass that one for the moment. For Mrs. Rogers, she was an accomplice to murder she didn't really know or want to be a part of. And that's why she's so early on the list. And I'm like, okay, if I'm going to indulge in your sick fantasy of how justice should be served, I would agree with that one. For MacArthur, it's like...
I feel like he should have been last.
You think MacArthur should have been last?
Not MacArthur, I'm sorry. Marston.
I would say Marston.
But Marston is not the type who could get to hang himself.
No, Marston wouldn't have enough remorse to do that.
No.
Which, so that's part of what it comes down to, I think. Mr. Rogers, I feel like, should be much higher on the list.
I agree.
My mom worked for most of my childhood as an activities director in nursing homes.
Yeah.
And
That's
she usually worked in pretty good nursing homes. And she was always awesome with the residents. But I saw more than my fair share of elderly abuse as a child.
Yeah.
And the idea of someone actively withholding first off, he actively withheld medicine knowing it would kill her, and his reason for doing that was to get her money.
Yeah, to get their
So not only was he committing murder, but it was for selfish reasons. It was for monetary gain.
That's why you don't tell anyone what's in the will until after you're dead.
So, like, to me, Mr. Rogers is pretty... And, like, the fact that he dragged his wife into this scheme is also pretty repulsive.
Yeah, because obviously his wife wanted nothing to do with this.
Now, Ms. Brent, again, I hate her on a personal level.
Yes, I hate her on a personal level.
But I do not blame her for that girl's death.
No, the girl made her own decision.
And so I think that even if you are even if you are adhering to Wargrave's standards, she should be higher. She should be earlier on the list.
However, she kind of she sees herself as being an upright Christian woman, and it's like, oh, there's a whole other story of this teenage girl randomly showing up pregnant, and everybody shunned her, and then now we have Christmas.
Right.
So it's like, you say you hold to these ideal beliefs, but it's just your way to hold yourself above someone else.
Yeah.
So maybe that was his justification with Emily Brent.
Maybe. The other one that gets me is Detective Bloor. Because he falsified evidence and put an innocent man in jail, but does it ever explicitly say that he knew the man was innocent, or did he legitimately think the man was guilty? Like, I know it doesn't matter in the long run, because obviously imprisoning someone wrongfully is bad no matter what. Yeah. But if he thought he was getting a murderer off the streets, if he thought lying would get a murderer off the streets.
I believe it is expressed that he did it so he could say he caught a murderer and get his promotion. Okay. So it was kind of he didn't really care if he was innocent or guilty.
That's a good example of how gray this can all be, because I'm sitting here saying, well, lying under oath to put someone away if you legitimately think they committed the crime is not as bad as lying under oath if you know someone's innocent. They're both bad. Lying under oath is always bad, but I'm over here splitting.
Always bad, but is it worth your life?
Right, and I'm splitting hairs, but that's my point. It's like, I'm splitting hairs, and so from Wargrave's perspective, it's like, you can't, instead of trying to deal with all of the murky questions of morality, you just, everything is either good or bad. Which makes life easier, but it also makes life much harsher.
Yeah, and I mean, like, none of these things these people did were good, per se. But I think, if anything, some of them, their greatest sin was inaction. Yes. And even, like, with Vera, she realizes her mistake and she attempts to fix it and fails.
Right.
And to quote Next Generation, sometimes you can do everything right and still lose.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting to me, and I think this is another part of me that... Because, okay, when I was in high school, we read The Scarlet Letter in the 11th grade. In junior year of high school, we read The Scarlet Letter.
I'm sorry, I should not make that face.
And we had a class project where we were given a list of all the sins that were committed in the Scarlet Letter. No, excuse me. Yeah, it was the Scarlet Letter. We were given a list of all the sins that were committed by different people in the Scarlet Letter and other various sins that...
Yes.
And we were all put into groups of 5 and asked to rank the sins from 1 to 8. 1 being the worst sin and 8 being the least offensive sin.
I'd go with pride as 1.
Well, but that's not what it was. It wasn't that esoteric. It was
Oh.
like,
So what did...
it was like coveting your neighbor's wife specifically.
Oh, no.
Adultery. Murder.
Murder is above adultery. For sure.
For sure. You say for sure, but my group...
In my book.
In your book, but we were in groups. We weren't doing it one-on-one. If we had done it one-on-one, it wouldn't have been as interesting of a lesson. But when you have 5 people in a group, you have 5 different perspectives coming to the table, 5 different opinions on how the world works. I had people in my group arguing that adultery was worse than murder.
What? Nobody's lives end.
I mean...
Life is sacred.
I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that
Springfield.
No, that has nothing to do with it. I'm just saying that every person has a different perspective coming to something. And so you look at characters like this and you're like... When I look at these characters, I have certain opinions about who is worse and who is better. And those opinions are colored not only by what they did, but how they react to what they did.
Yeah.
For example, Vera shows a lot of regret for the things she's done.
She does. She feels awful. It haunts her.
Marston has no regret
whatsoever. He is
Lombard
far
has
worse
no
than Vera
regret.
Claiborne.
And like, to me, like, not only the crime itself is judged, but how you respond to it. And that's not how the justice system works even now.
No.
Like, it doesn't matter how sorry you are. If you committed murder, you've committed murder.
Yes.
And I think that's right. I don't think that somebody should get to walk free because they're really, really sorry that they killed somebody.
I'm really sorry, dude. My bad.
But in the court of public opinion, which is really what they're all being tried in,
Yes.
the court of this one man's public opinion, the
Well-
fact that people who show regret are considered worse by him than people who have none is just interesting to me. And I wonder if that's reflective of the fact that he is psychopathic and unable to feel empathy or regret himself.
That's a very good point. Because he believes that the whole reason he writes this letter and puts it in a bottle and throws it into the sea is because he eventually wants recognition for his work.
Which is what all serial killers
Yeah,
want.
that's what all serial killers want. But it's just, he was able to... It says when he was a judge, he was able to, like, tell who was guilty and who wasn't, and maybe that's because he could, recognize in kind.
Or more realistically, he just thought he could tell who was guilty
Yeah.
based on his own personal biases.
Which is a dangerous thing for the justice system. Yeah, this book gave me nightmares, Casey.
Yeah.
Nightmares. Even though I read it twice. Because I would always have dreams that I was running through an empty, like, white house, and I'm like, I know someone is there, but I am alone. And then, like, I would open up a doorway, and there would be a noose there, and I'd be like, ah! And then I'd wake up. Oof.
Now, if
So
you
congratulations, you've scarred me for life.
I do try. It is my goal. Now, if you were in Vera's position, if you had accidentally caused the death of a child, been confronted about it, and then murdered a man to save yourself, do you think you would be guilt-ridden enough to want to kill yourself?
If someone was gonna kill me and I shot them dead, I would still feel guilty about it, even though I knew I did it.
Sure.
Because they were gonna kill me.
But would your guilt be so extreme that you would want to die as well?
I really
Can't say.
don't know. I really don't know unless I'm put in that situation, and I
Sure.
hope to God I never am.
Well, of course.
But like,
Just from a purely speculative point of view. Like, for me,
okay,
my immediate response
speculatively,
is...
if I was responsible for the death of a child, you know me, I probably would be pretty close to that line.
Yeah.
If something like that happened.
Honestly, yeah. I would
Or-
feel more guilt for the child dying on my watch than I would
Yes.
for shooting that man. I probably would feel guilt that I took a life, but also feel like it was absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, if I were to find
Like
out
if
later,
someone breaks
if
into
I
my
were to
house
find
with a
out
gun,
later
I'm
that
shooting them.
if I were to find out later that I was wrong, and that
Oh,
he
I feel
was
terrible.
yeah, but in the moment with the information that she had, it would be
She
hard.
couldn't have made a better decision.
So I don't know how much of her
I'm not
guilt.
saying her decision was good. I'm just saying there
Right.
wasn't a better option for her.
I'm not sure, right? Because like I mean, as all likelihood, if she had not shot him, he would have shot her.
He would have shot her. Yeah.
Because he thought she was the murderer. And it's like that very Lord of the Flies thing is like the longer you're away from civilization, the more animalistic you become.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the point that the judge was trying to
The fight
make.
for survival.
So this book has a very bleak ending because it's like, even though it's wrapped up and we're satisfied by the answers and like the locked door mystery is solved,
no one gets away.
No one gets away. It's not like even in the worst horror movies, even in Halloween and Jason,
there's always one.
There's always a survivor.
And there isn't one in this. It's no survivors.
Not even the killer.
Not even the killer survives.
So yeah, it's pretty bleak.
I find that very distressing when the killer makes it out.
It's pretty bleak. And by Agatha Christie's standards even, it's pretty bleak. Because usually she has survivors and usually the killer is brought to justice.
Yeah, I've read a ton of Agatha Christie. Mostly Hercule Poirot. Mm-hmm. But
Poirot always finds his man.
Man, this is bleak.
Even the mousetrap, which is fairly bleak. The killer is revealed and captured.
Yeah. And
there are survivors. This one is not. There's nobody left, and then there were none.
Yeah. They mean it.
So yeah, this book gives you a lot to think about. It's my favorite Agatha Christie. It's as bleak as it is. It's my favorite because I feel like it sticks with me longer than any of the others.
Yeah. So I immediately had to jump to our next book so I could stop having weird dreams.
Well, speaking of stopping, how many bottles of wine would you give this?
How many bottles of wine? Well, like I said, I finished it immediately, had to go back and do it again because I'm like, what? I had to figure it out. Mm-hmm. I did enjoy it. I will also be content to never read it again.
Yeah.
So, 2.5 bottles.
2.5. That's
2.5. That's the lowest rating I've ever had. Oh, don't worry. We're going to have a lower one. I know what our next book is.
The next book we're reading?
Yeah.
Next recording? Interesting.
Spoiler alert.
Lower than 2.5 for that book?
Lower than 2.5 for that book.
Disagree. Anyway, I would give this book 3.5.
I know you really love this book.
I love this book. I've read it 5 or 6 times. The reason I'm giving it lower than 4 stars, 4 bottles, is A, because it's a very bleak ending, and you just feel kind of gross after it. And that's not fun. Even though it does make you think it's not fun.
I finished it right before I had to go to work and be cheerful.
And B, the other reason, and this isn't something we really touched on in the book other than at the beginning with the title, is very racist.
Oh, it's so racist.
And very anti-Semitic as well. Another person was murdered in this book that we didn't mention.
Yes.
There's an attorney, an unscrupulous attorney. And
Wargrave's assistant.
Wargraves went to him to set the whole thing up, offered the man an antacid that was actually poison and killed him. But multiple times throughout the book, he is referred to as Jew boy. Just very derogatory, anti-Semitic.
That was taken out of my version.
Well, yeah, you said you had soldiers, too.
Yeah, I had soldiers.
The version I read was published in, like, the 60s, I think. Like, I just pulled it off Project Gutenberg. Yeah. So I'm sure there have been changes made. But it's not the first time Agatha Christie has had anti-Semitic sentiment in her books. And you can argue all the live long day whether it's a product of her time or whether it was her own authorial opinion that was kind of tainting the novel. But it does leave a bad taste in my mouth. And so that, along with the fact that you just feel bleak after you finish it.
You do. You feel bleak and you feel
I'd give it 3.5.
So you go have a lemon drop martini and watch memes on the internet until you feel better.
That said, our average there would be 3 bottles.
3 bottles.
Which is not bad. So
no?
It's an average rating. I think this is a divisive book.
It's dead average.
I don't think the book is dead average itself.
Bad turn of phrase.
I don't think the book is average so much as it's divisive.
It is, and it does give you a lot to think about.
So, and then there will none.
Yes, and so we will continue. We're going to pause our descent into the good and creepy for Halloween.
All right, so thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
All right, see you later. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. For more information, visit us at litliteraturePodcast.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And remember, too much work and no vacation deserves at least a small libation. Cheers!